Landowners from all across the state arrived in Brookings tonight for an opportunity to hear more about landowner rights and CO2 pipelines.
I-Team reporter Beth Warden also at that meeting tonight and brings us details on the questions that were being raised. Beth, good evening.
Hello, Andrea and Brian. A meeting room at the Dakota Bank Center was filled with an audience ready to hear the debate. Questions coming from a moderator and the responses from a proponent and opponent of CO2 pipelines. Navigator Pipelines representative Elizabeth Burns-Thompson spoke in favor of the pipelines, pointing to the claims of financial benefits and more stability for ethanol plants. The opponent, Republican legislator John Hansen from Del Rapids. Hansen highlighted safety issues and what he believes to be a lack of information due to the withholding of models that depict what a breach in the pipeline could look like.
We have a plentiful of good actors that sit in this room. The unfortunate part of the world that we live in today is that there is individuals with ill intent out there, and we do necessarily have to protect certain information, be it dispersion models. I believe also as part of that commentary that we were having at the PUC was a conversation about emergency response plans as well.
And with all due respect, the biggest threat to freedom and safety of these property owners is not bad actors. It's carbon sequestration pipeline companies that want to take their land without consent and put a dangerous pipeline in their ground.
And while Burns-Thompson brought words of reassurance regarding pipeline safety, Hansen notes one of the states known to be applying pressure for the pipelines wants them located elsewhere.
Transportation of CO2 is not new in this country, and not just transportation of CO2, but transportation of CO2 as a pressurized hazardous liquid.
California is doing with these pipelines, there's a moratorium in place. So in South Dakota here, we're bending to the market regulators in California, and they themselves won't even subject themselves to the risk of these pipelines. That's absurd.
And the debate was facilitated by a newly formed organization, Sioux River Republican Women. Directors say their goal is to inform, not influence. Andrea?
All right, Beth, thank you.